Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. Let's get started here. It is my pleasure to be here this afternoon with Claudia Arndt from the International Livestock Research Institute and Donald Moore from the Global Dairy Platform. I will give you a minute to introduce yourselves and tell a little bit more about your work. But before we do that, I want to introduce myself. I am Fernanda Ferreira, and I am the Agriculture Methane Director for Clean Air Task Force. We are a global nonprofit organization, and we work in multiple projects, multiple areas. Livestock methane is one of them. And we are also working to advance policies, technologies, and market pathways that reduce methane from livestock, while also improving livestock productivity and resilience. So that's our goal as an organization and as a program. And so we all know that livestock products that are vital for food security, nutrition, and livelihoods. This is true everywhere, but particularly important in developing countries. And we also know that the agriculture is a major methane emitter. And so I think the challenge and the opportunity that we have here is to discuss how can we work with a very complex sector that it's not all about emissions. We're talking about economics, livelihoods, culture, food security, nutrition, many other aspects. And so how can we advance this discussion, taking into account all these other aspects? So that's the main goal of this panel. And this is a conversation. There's just a few of us here, so I think it will be very, very informal. Of course, we have a few points of discussion, but this is more a conversation for us, hopefully to have something actionable after we leave this panel here. And so I will start asking both Donald and Claudia a question. The first thing is, okay, of course. Yes, so I'll ask you to introduce yourself. Thank you. The organization that we work for and why this integration between, as we said in the title, development, markets, finance, and policy is important, and why we have to think about all these topics when we're talking about agriculture methane.
Okay, that's a lot of questions. I'm Claudia Arndt. I'm working for the International Livestock Research Institute, based in Nairobi, Kenya. I'm leading a lab that's called Mazingira Lab, Mazingira Center, and Mazingira means environment in Kiswahili. So we're looking at the environmental impact of livestock, and with a focus on greenhouse gas emissions, carbon fluxes, and also biodiversity. So we're trying to have a system approach. We're trying to measure mitigation, and we're trying to link that to MRVs and also carbon finance. We are working with biogas digesters, and that sector, actually carbon finance, is quite advanced because they have carbon financing systems in place for getting these biogas digesters to smallholder livestock producers by reducing the price of these biogas digesters to these farmers, or giving loans to them and using carbon finance to actually pay for that as well. So thank you.
I get my own microphone. Okay. I'm Donald Moore. I'm the executive director of an organization called the Global Dairy Platform, and I'm based out of Chicago, Illinois. But the organization that I run has got members in 37 different countries around the world. There are quite a number of things we do as an organization, but as directly relates to today's conversation, there's three things I wanted to mention. The first is that we run a global platform called the Dairy Sustainability Framework, where we monitor, track, and report on sustainability performance of the dairy sector around the world. We launched this back in 2013, so we've been doing it for a while now, and we've got a number of years of data where we track 11 different indicators across the dairy sector, everything from social, economic, and environmental outcomes. And today we have a little over 30% of all the milk in the world reporting through that framework, which covers 52% of the formal milk, because as we know in large parts of Africa, etc., a lot of milk doesn't actually go through the formal system. I can tell you in terms of the global dairy sector what our key priorities are in sustainability, and a number of them relate to the sort of discussions we're having here. For a number of years now, the number one indicator was greenhouse gas emissions. That was the number one priority. In the last 2 years, it's changed. We now have animal care actually coming up as our number one priority. And we put that down in part to a program we launched in 2021, which was called Pathways to Dairy Net Zero, which is another one of the initiatives that we lead in Global Dairy Platform on behalf of the dairy sector. There we have over 200 major organizations from around the world, including ILRI, thank you, signed on to support Pathways to Dairy Net Zero. And the bit I think that relates directly to this discussion today is work that we're doing in emerging or developing markets. We did a piece of work with the US government, the former US administration, to analyze greenhouse gas emissions, and particularly methane, from every country in the world that came from their dairy sector. And we prioritized those from the highest emitting right down. So 190 something countries were engaged in that. And we then picked 10 countries that between them represented about 30% of the emissions that were coming from the dairy sector. They were emerging market countries that between them were 30% of our emissions. The US State Department wrote to those countries, ministers of agriculture, inviting them to become part of this program as an early adopter of the program. And we've just recently completed work with ILRI, with FAO, with EFAD, and with others to secure $358 million for climate financing in East Africa from a combination of Green Climate Fund and EFAD, who are the two major funders. And that program is primarily focused on improving productivity to the point where we increase yield per cow, we increase farmers' income, but the whole idea is to have as much nutrition flowing through the value chain, and at the same time, we are reducing greenhouse gas emissions with a particular focus on methane. So that's sort of a number of the things we're doing. The last program I wanted to mention, and I'm talking too long, but luckily we don't have all our panelists here, so I get to talk longer. The last one is we also implemented a program recently with FAO. We designed a methodology called the Dairy Impact Methodology to analyze and report on the socioeconomic impact that dairy has in the world. And last year we launched a report on 187 countries that looked at, as the dairy sector develops, what happens to the number of farms. They come down. What happens to the income on farm? It rises. It rises faster than any other agricultural commodity as you invest in it. What happens to access to nutrition? Access to nutrition improves. What happens to the cost of that nutrition in terms of purchasing power? What happens to government revenues from a tax base, etc.? And we now have a very large database of evidence about the impact from a socio-economic perspective of investment in one major agricultural commodity.
No, that's excellent. And I want to just make a comment. In Brazil here, every year we have a report that's launched about the most profitable. They compare, it's an institute in São Paulo state. They compare the economics of a lot of different agricultural activities. And high productivity dairy is usually at the top when it comes to income and profitability, which is very interesting. I mean, consider that when we talk about large dairies or high productivity dairies in Brazil, they're not the US systems. They're actually 1,000 lactating cows in Brazil is actually considered a huge farm, which is not the reality in some areas, for instance, in the US. So just to give a perspective. So I think that's very interesting. But to build on two things that you mentioned, we're going to try to break it down because you both spoke about a lot of different things: research, finance, new technologies, nutrition, food security, income, measurement. So there are a lot of things here for us to discuss. So let's talk a little bit about one by one, and I would invite, if you want to make a comment with this is. That we're sitting here just because of microphone and we need to use it because they're transmitting, but this is a small audience. We can have a very open, informal discussion. But one thing that I want to talk about, let's start first with the aspect of nutrition. We know that dairy products, regardless of the level of income or the type of country that we're talking about, is an important source of nutrition. And I want to before we dive into the more greenhouse gas discussion, and more specifically about methane, let's talk a little bit about nutrition, then economics, then we can go into this more specific topic. Donald, I will start with you. In your role as the executive director of the Global Dairy Platform, but also with an important activity in the area of sustainability, how do you integrate nutrition and food security into this discussion? So you talked a little bit about it, but I would like to learn more.
Yeah, sure. I'll just go back a little bit and talk about the size of farms, because I thought that was a really interesting comment you made about here in Brazil. Globally, there are 133 million dairy farms in the world, according to the UN Food and Agricultural Organization. Less than 0.1% of those farms have more than 100 cows. So the dairy industry, the global average is 3 cows. And so even though there are some farms in the United States with 10,000 cows, there are many, many farms in other parts of the world with 1 or 2 cows. And in fact, in India, the world's largest dairy producer, the average herd size is even smaller than 3 cows. So dairy is not necessarily an industry that is all about scale. It's about an industry of inclusion with smallholder farmers all over the world. The way in which we link nutrition into this, nutrition is fundamental to the dairy sector. We know what dairy nutrition does. We know what dairy does for nutrition. We know what that nutrition does for health, and linking that health then to outcomes for society. In parts of East Africa, and I'm sure you'll touch on this, Claudia, we know that 35% of children under the age of 5 are stunted. We launched a program in Tanzania in 2018 called Dairy Nourishes Africa, which was focused on how do we improve nutritional outcomes to help address issues of stunting, and in particular stunting, but stunting and wasting, using dairy as the driver for that. And it wasn't about let's import dairy products from Europe or whatever. It was about developing the local dairy value chain. We found out by doing that we had to go back and start working at the farm level, and we did a number of pilots. In fact, I'm trying to remember the name of the guy from Hillary who was involved. I've just forgotten his name, from the Tanzanian office. But we started working at farm level, and with some fairly basic interventions, we were able to increase productivity by 25. And at the same time, that reduced emissions intensity by around 30%, and farmer incomes raised by 29%. So a lot of economic, social, environmental impacts, but in particular, we were focused on the nutritional outcomes. So these things are all interlinked. And it's important that we don't try and isolate them, that we don't try and pull one element out and say dairy's all about greenhouse gas emissions or dairy's just about nutrition. These things are interlinked.
Thank you. There's also an aspect not only on nutrition, but also on safety. So we have another project where we're actually looking at milk safety. So we're trying to improve milk safety with different interventions. So the milk has better quality overall, and that milk safety improvement will also lead, I'm sure, to improved milk production, because the things we're going to help farmers implement are going to help with health of the animals as well. So there's that point as well. From a nutrition perspective, I think in rural areas in Africa it's very important to have livestock, because I know I agree that people can, it's good for people to make some changes to the diet to reduce their carbon footprint in regions of the world where it's possible, where you have access to things you need. But sometimes in rural African settings, there isn't that much you can grow, but you can have cows in these settings, and they will produce milk, for example, on a daily basis. So there is some protein you have on a daily basis. So it is very important for certain regions to have cattle for nutrition. Also for India, for example, you have a lot of vegetarians, but they're still consuming dairy products, right? So it is important part of their diet as well, probably. I haven't looked at the numbers, and a complete protein is more easy to get with animal products, and animal protein is also more accessible than plant protein. So you need to eat more of the plant protein. than you need to have from the animal protein. And then also there's other micronutrients that you have in animal products, like the B vitamins, for example, that are not in plant products. So you need that. And there's one aspect actually, which I experienced myself because I wasn't eating like lots of dairy products. I was eating dairy products, not much meat. But I ended up with, because being in Kenya, you get parasite infections and you may not always notice. And then I actually went to the doctor and she was telling me I was vitamin B deficient. I was like, how is this even happening? So there's other environmental impact, like things that need to be changed, because if you have parasite infections, which I think are quite common in children as well, that and adults, that you need to treat that as well, because if you have it, that will reduce your body's uptake of whatever you're eating. So you actually need more. I'm not a human nutritionist, I'm a dairy cow nutritionist, but I understand the meaning about nutrients and what you need. But like, I think studies around that would actually be also important to better understand what is the actual need, because we're not looking at a super hygienic environment where everybody is healthy. So the more of on a, like, what is actually needed on the ground, not just like studies. Because if I do a study on improving milk production in my lab, I'm going to get much better results than I will get on a farm, because there are so many other factors on the farm influencing what's going to happen, and you will never get that high of yield. So yeah, thank you.
Can I just comment on that? I think two interesting points that Claudia mentioned there. The first was around the role that livestock production can have in different parts of the world where the land is really not suitable for growing crops. According to the FAO, 2/3 of the world's agricultural land is permanent pasture, meadow, or savanna. And the way that contributes to our food system is the grazing of livestock. So if we were to take livestock away, we would lose a major contribution to the food system globally. So I think, some of the narrative that we've heard in past years, and I think it's starting to change here at COP, but some of the narrative in the past about the sort of the detrimental impact of livestock, and therefore removing livestock and replacing it with more plant-based food. I don't think it was actually practical. I don't think we'd done the modeling work to say, is it possible for us to grow enough food to do that? I think from my perspective, what I often say to people is, we know what dairy does from a nutrition perspective. We know what that nutrition does for health. We know what it does for livelihoods. We know what it does for women's empowerment, youth employment, rural cohesion. So we know all the good that we do in the dairy sector. What we need to focus on is, how do we, like all agricultural commodities, and I stress all agricultural commodities, how do we reduce the impact that we're having in our natural environment? Actually, some of that impact is positive. So how do we accentuate the positive and limit the more negative, which is really where we maybe start to talk about methane and the other issues with gas. And by the way, I have visited the Mazangere, I probably mispronounced, Mazangere facility. It is very impressive. So well done.
Amazing. I think you both mentioned something, and I want to highlight a number that you brought, Donald, that we have over 133 million dairy farmers in the world. So I think that gives us an idea of the social importance from an economic perspective, from a livelihood perspective, but also from a social impact. If we were to take these farmers out of business, this is a massive social impact. What are they going to? So then we're going to start engaging with, the ministries of cities, and then social development, and then job at the city level. So we have a lot of interactions there as well, and I think that gives us a little bit of an idea of the impact and how careful we have to be when we think about this. How we're going to reduce emissions, or how we're going to reduce the environmental impact. There's no way not to have an impact. This is a utopia, really. We're producing food, we have all these people we need to eat. But your point is critical. Like, how can we continuously evolve towards a less impactful or more positive system, and this will be very context specific. Do you want to make a
Yeah, I was going to just comment. You know, the 133 million dairy farms. All the numbers I'm quoting are from FAO, so they're not our numbers. There are 600 million people living on dairy farms around the world, and then if you add on to that the people whose livelihoods are derived upstream or downstream from the farm, either inputs to the farm or processing afterwards, there's another 400 million people linked to the dairy industry. So it is supporting the livelihoods of 1 billion people in the world. Now, to me, that's a pretty big number. It's like 1/7 or whatever of the humans on the planet today. And you're absolutely right. This is something that you can't just mess with. You know, we need to find ways to help them to improve the outcomes from their farms and at the same time manage this just transition process that we keep talking about here. And to me, just transition isn't just an expression in one of these negotiating rooms. It actually translates to real action on the ground, and that's what I think we're missing in some of these discussions, is how do we bring these high-level talks down to the sort of projects that ILRI and we are implementing on the ground in parts of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me move, now that we're talking about this, let me now go from nutrition to economics, because I think this is another pillar that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about all this discussion around reducing emissions from livestock. And then we can be, next step will be more specific around the emissions and the science around that. So on the economics part of it, we are talking about, you know, all these people, billion people living off livestock, dairy, more specifically. And when we talk about reducing emissions from the systems, there are basically these two approaches, and they complement each other. One is to implement what we know it works, and it will be very context specific. There are a lot of technologies. Brazil is a good example through Embrapa of all these technologies that were developed for the tropical environment, new grasses, new ways of managing it, adapted genetics and all that. But we need to make sure they're implemented and that they're generating a positive economic impact for the farmers. The other pillar would be innovation. We're not short of innovation, but innovation is always great. More science, more technology based on new discoveries that we want to unlock, but some markets or some areas are more ripe to the kind of innovations to reduce methane more specifically that are in the pipeline right now. So my question for both of you is, when it comes to economics and accounting for these two levers that we want to pull depending on where we are, how do we see from an actionable or using an actionable strategy, how do you see that being applied in the different contexts of the world? What do you think is still needed to improve productivity from a project level to, you know, to scale this implementation of productivity and the new technologies? I'll start with you, Claudia.
Thank you, Fernanda. So I think for implementation, what is needed, we actually need implementation projects to evaluate what is the gain of certain intervention packages to these farms, and what are the costs of implementing it, and what is the profit actually. Because we need to make sure it's profitable, and we need to see if it's profitable in the context. So there will be different packages for different contexts, really. And we need to understand and inform the governments and financial institutions what is the most important in this context and where do you need to put your money, because money is always going to be limited. And if we're giving finance to farmers to maybe implement things, we need to make sure it's going to be profitable for them so they can actually pay back. And we need to make sure we're investing into the things that make most sense in that environment. So for me, that is the most important, that we start small, we figure out, okay, what is the best here, and then we can scale it. But because I see too many implementation projects where we don't collect that data, I cannot make an economic analysis on the packages, on the individual practices, because World Bank, they are implementing practices that we know, but then I don't know what was actually the effect of it, because it wasn't implemented in a way that we could scientifically go and backstop and say like, okay, cool, that improved productivity by a liter of milk and profitability by that and that much. So if we could only make that small tweak into implementation projects to allow us doing that, that would be fantastic, to be honest. So I think from there you can go. And then for actual strategies like innovations, so we have one project which is a low methane forage project from Bezos Earth Foundation and Gates, and Global Methane Hub is also helping to coordinate it, where we're looking at legumes and like going through the gene banks that the CG has to potentially find forages that could potentially have secondary compounds that reduce methane emissions, because it's been showing that legumes can reduce methane emissions by like 9%, but now we need to see, is there something we can actually find? Is there something we can bring on the ground that farmers can plant? And legumes actually would be nice if we find something that legume is a little bit difficult in, like, it will increase the protein intake of animals, and protein is limiting not only for humans in the global south, but also for the animal diet. But it also has compounds like the tannins that help to reduce the methane that can bind the protein, make it unavailable for the animal. So we also need to be a little bit careful there, but it would be something that could potentially help us to reduce emissions on the farm if we find something that can be fed in a way that is not too high either, because often you need to feed like 40% of that legume, and if I need to feed 40% of a certain legume, that's also not sustainable. So there's also the idea that they want to do genetic modified plants as a product for the future, for example. So that's where that project is looking at. Thank you.
Yeah, interesting. The research that's going on there is really fascinating. From our perspective, I think I just want to refer to a piece of research that came out of the Global Research Alliance on Agricultural Greenhouse Gases. They're a knowledge partner for the Pathways to Dairy Net Zero program. And they did a piece of analysis when we first launched the program, and they said that the potential for us to reduce greenhouse gas in the dairy sector, there's a 40% opportunity, which is about practice change. There's another 35%, which relates to technologies that are available or just coming available. Now, at the time they did that, some of the methane inhibiting substances were just coming available. And that still means there's about 25%. If we're trying to get to net zero, it's about 25% we don't have a solution for yet. And that's the work that's going on in ILRI and in Embrapa and other research organizations around the world. But where I was going to head was I was going to focus on the 40%. And there, it doesn't matter to me whether you're in the United States, Denmark, or you're in Kenya, or you're in India. If you plotted every dairy system, every dairy farmer on a normal distribution, you'd find people who were really, really top performing, and you'd find people who were underperforming. And the opportunity for us to move the lower performers up to the middle is really significant. 40% potential. Now, of course, you'll never get 100% of that happening. You know, so it's kind of a dream. But we know from the work we did in Tanzania that we were able to reduce emissions intensity by 29-30% roughly by some very simple interventions to do with feed presentation, clean water, and some basic training on animal husbandry. So there are ways that we can reduce it. And of course, the average emissions in different parts of the world are worth knowing, you know. So in parts of East Africa, you know, the emissions intensity is around 8 to 12 kgs of CO2 per kg of milk, whereas in somewhere like Europe, it's 1.2 to 1.4. You know, so getting the Europeans down from 1.2 to 1.4 is a more economically challenging, because that needs technologies, that needs implementation, whereas we've still got a lot of room in practice change in some of those emerging or developing markets.
I think originally when I took the microphone, I wanted to say something else. I forgot that already. But what is important is actually on adoption. So when we're talking about scaling, we're looking at, so we know how to measure, we know how, like, how to measure increases on the farm, but I think we have been leaving the social science a little bit behind on how we're doing extension. And I think there need to be different. I think a farmer should have a choice of different extension programs. So there are mobile apps that are available that can train you. There are extensionists, even though Kenyans say extension has failed them. What isn't, because it's a huge country. Like, how is a government ever going to have money to get to these farms? It's a very big country. The population is about 40 million. The streets are bad. Anytime we do anything in the like data collection, we're doing like maximum 4 farms a day for collecting data because it's difficult. It's not an easy environment to come around. So there's farmer to farmer training we're working on, and there's so many different ways, and not each way will work for each farmer. So I think that is important to note and see what works for different farmers and how can we optimize it and how can we help that extension service to move forward. And that hasn't been done enough. And adoption usually, but also I'm working with an American professor on the mastitis project where we're reducing mastitis by doing better udder health training. She told me 30% adoption in the US is good. She used to work in Wisconsin. Like, she's like, that is a good result. So we also need to because as a scientist in the beginning, when I started out, yeah, I'm doing these modeling with 100% adoption. And then as you get more senior, you're like, no. So in my work, not as a person, bro. But it's so we also need to be realistic there. What can we actually do? Because if we stack everything and we don't know if everything is additional, that's the other thing. We can implement different things, but we don't know if it's additional. I can get new genetics on the farm. I can get in the Holstein cow. No, what is that Holstein cow going to do? It's been super skinny and maybe die of some disease because it's not suited for that environment, and the farmer doesn't have any feed to feed it. So I had one more story, then I'll give over to Donald. I had a farmer who was like, I improved my cow. He's a good farmer. And then I ended up with an animal I couldn't feed anymore with the resources I had on the farm. So I sold that. She was performing really well, but it's like I sold the cow and I needed to realize I needed to scale back to get a cow that I actually can take care of. And often when you go to the farmers in Kenya, they think they get a Holstein cow, all issues solved because it's been promoted in the wrong way. So there's also narrative for the farmers that need to be changed, because you could also want to have a Ferrari, but it will never get down to the farm. You need a different car here. So look at it that way. So yeah, thank you.
What I took out of that was that Ferraris and farmers don't go together in Kenya. Is that right? So, but your point is really, really good. Your point is really good, and that is that even when you train, even when you show, even when you demonstrate, sometimes this doesn't stick. So the project I was talking about that we did in Tanzania, where we showed them if you change the way you present the feed to them, it's largely a cut and carry operation. So cut feed delivered to the animals in a stall, and they were dropping the feed on the ground. And we said, no, if you chop that feed, put it in a manger, more of it will be consumed. And after a number of months, you go back and visit the farms, and some of them aren't bothered. They don't do it because they can produce 3-4 liters a day rather than 6 liters or whatever it might be. They produce 3-4 liters a day, and it's less work. So some of them are motivated by the income. Some of them are motivated by other reasons. Some of them just don't have the time. It's as simple as that.
Okay, there's another aspect that needs to be realized. Farmers and smallholder farmers particularly, they have a lot of things going on. Dairy is not their main production. They have tea there, they're having other things. And that is good on the other hand, because there's climate change, and climate change is going to get worse. So the more things they're doing, the more resilient they are. I had an Uber driver in Nairobi. He's like, I have cows. They're not doing so well, so bad. They could do better, but then I would need to be on the farm. Then I could not be driving that Uber over here. So how is he going to feed the cows during a drought when there's not enough feed? He's going to get some money from driving the Uber to feed these cows. So that needs to be realized. Then the monetary gain is maybe not necessarily the motivation there. And sometimes people have cows because they like cows. It's Kenya. Sorry, they like cows. It's a cultural involvement. They like cows, and there's like or some have them even for the manure. They need the manure for fertilizing their crops because fertilizer is expensive. So there's so many things.
You're right. That's why I said time. So time is often the key limiting factor for some of them as well, and prioritization. Yeah.
And I think also an important point that we have to think about is we are not going to solve all the problems, and we're not expecting all countries in all systems to have, okay, everybody now has to achieve this high level productivity. It's very context specific. I remember just another anecdote before we move into policies, and we're about to, because I know you have to leave a little earlier. But this case is so interesting. I remember I worked for many years at Embrapa, and one point that we were discussing was about how can we increase the use of artificial insemination in these smaller herds to increase the genetic gain and reduce health. There was a lot of problems with using bulls, and I remember farmers saying, oh, we can't do that because if we use timed AI, it's too expensive. But if we don't, I'll have to keep washing my cows until I recognize which ones are the time to breed, and then I will miss my kids' meeting at school or my soccer in Sunday. So there are all these aspects that we have to consider. It's not as simple as, okay, let's put this policy and economic motivation, because even if you have the economics, even if you have the finance, even if you have the right policy, you still we have to wait a long time for you see the change, as you said, in that aspect. Okay, so let's move a little bit before we finish this panel. Let's discuss just very quickly about policies, because we're kind of, okay, we have this economic aspect, this nutritional aspect, but we have to reduce greenhouse gases. And how can we leverage policies, pragmatic policies that are accounting for development, nutrition, food security, and positive climate impact? So I'd love to hear from you, share a few, especially, well, we were in Africa, we discussed a little bit earlier about some governments being very ambitious when it comes to NDC, but not having really an implementation or sectorial plan, and the other way around. So just to wrap this up, a little bit of your thoughts when it comes to pragmatic policies in the space.
Okay, so most of African countries have a livestock master plan, so they know where they want to go and means of production. They also have the national determined contributions, but let's face it, there's no subsidies for anything. So it's not like in Europe or in the US where the government gives money to the farmer to do a certain thing. It's not there. So there are policies, but the help that the farmers are receiving from the government is very limited because it's just very costly and like the situation. So the governments are committed and they're working with the farmers as well, but like it needs to be profitable. Anything that's done needs to be profitable. There will not be subsidies for anything. Even I think if we do carbon credit projects, even then it needs to be profitable without the carbon credits, because if anything happens to the carbon credits, then it's over again. So because the farmers will stop it, because then it's not profitable anymore. So yeah, that's my take on it.
I agree. I think you've hit the nail on the head. And even in markets where there may be some subsidies available, again, it has to be profitable without the subsidies, because governments they can be fickle. They can give and they can take. And we had that in the US with a change of government where there was a program which was going to be $20 billion for climate smart agriculture, and it's changed. So you can't build your house on sand. You've got to build it on rock. And so I totally agree with you. Everything we do has to ultimately be based in an economic value proposition for farmers. But I just want to add one thing. You know, it worries me that we're constantly talking about this challenge being a challenge for farmers. This challenge is a challenge for humanity. If we believe we are facing an existential threat to humanity from climate change, and agriculture has the potential to help solve a large component of that, it's on all of us. It's not on the farmers. So we've got to find a way to bring that into the public discourse, because farmers too often are vilified for what they're doing. Farmers are heroes, and we need to recognize them as such. And we need to find a way to help finance that. Now, you mentioned carbon markets. We've had a grant from the Gates Foundation we've been working with for the last 2 years, and we ran a program or a meeting in Nairobi with ILRI on this, looking at what are the issues that need to be solved and unlocked if we're going to find a way to connect farmers, and particularly smallholders, to carbon markets in different parts of the world. Now, this was livestock. It wasn't just dairy. It was livestock generally. And there are some spots of light, but there's also an awful lot of issues that need to be resolved first.
And I want to highlight some of the other initiatives. I was part of a panel. It was not dairy, it was beef, with big associations here in Brazil, some big processors, and they were talking about the role of the industry. And of course, this will depend on the market. More formal markets have more opportunities, but the role of the industry working directly with farmers to reduce the perceived risk when money is flowing to the sector. And they gave a lot of examples. A big bank in Brazil, Banco do Brasil, is doing that with major processors. I can say that Danone is one of them, but there are other beef processors as well. And that was very interesting because it really catalyzed a lot of action at the farm level. So there was, it was not policy, it was more like a private initiative. But I think we should think about these innovative ways of flowing finance to farmers, and finance that they need, not the finance that they are offering, because the products are very different in a lot of times.
I know in a lot of the more developed countries, the big dairy companies, other big industries as well, they've signed on to science-based targets, and so they have a really direct need and opportunity and promise that they're going to deliver on their scope 3 emissions reduction. So there's more direct control inside some of those industries, inside value chains, and we've been working to develop a mass balanced chain of custody model that would allow us to report emissions reductions from farm to processor, to CPG, to retailer. When you keep it in the value chain, you can claim the emissions reductions right throughout. But using reporting of tools that we're already having to follow, like greenhouse gas protocol, rather than trying to create something new. And that keeps it simple for the farmers. It's no increase in burden on them, but often those schemes are funded by the value chain itself. Consumers aren't necessarily willing to pay more, and getting external funding is very, very difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so if we could, we would be sitting here and discussing these topics for a long time, but we can't. So I would like to thank you, Claudia, for being here, for bringing your experience working in Africa, which is a very different, livestock is different. Even sometimes, your neighbor is very different than you. But I think it's important to have this perspective as well. Thank you also, Donald, for your leadership in the space globally, working with the industries, the companies, bringing this, having a seat at the table and being courageous to, discuss this challenge and opportunity right there. I think we need this collaboration across NGOs, industry, policy, governments, and science. And so thank you very much, and I hope we can continue this discussion after COP.